Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this week's tutorial we're going to be sewing our parabola. Now I've got my colours sorted out and I reserve the right to change my mind if I want to, but I think I'm altering the colours a little bit from when I did my first one here. And we're going to be starting in the middle of with a little circle and working our way out towards the edges. I've got some scissors for my thread, I've got a couple of embroidery number 7 needles, and I've also got some sellotape to secure my thread on the back. Now for the sort of centre bits we're not going to need a long length of thread, but I wouldn't sort of go too crazy and sort of make it too short. I would start with an arm's length because we're going to be filling in the circle with a couple of layers first. We're going to be starting with the centre of our flower and the layer that's underneath, which covers a little bit more of the circle, and then our second row will be the outer layer which doesn't cover as many holes. Now we start and finish our thread in exactly the same way, and I've switched my colour palette around a little bit, so I've got a darker colour which is going to be easier for the camera to pick up. So I'm going to bring my needle through from the back to the front, just somewhere on the outside of that circle, and I'm going to leave a tail. Now I don't like using knots here because it can over time just sort of start to bobble through on the front of your work, which I don't want. So I want that nice and flat, which I can tape down. I'm then going to be counting and working out where my thread is going to go. Now I always count my first stitch as number 1, and then I'm going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I'm coming round to the 8th stitch and I'm going to take my needle back through the paper. Now ideally with your thread art you don't want to have a massive stitch travelling across the back. Sometimes you'll see when we do some of the stitches we will have to do that, but basically now I'm going to be bringing my thread up to the left of where I went down and going down to the right of where I came up. So I find it helpful when I'm just getting underway to turn my paper over so I can see where I'm popping the needle through. And we're basically now using our straight lines going around the circle to build up that bottom layer. So as you can see we're just going to repeat that, turning over. So I'm always coming up by the side and going down in the next hole, and we'll know that we're finished because we would just come full circle back to where we started. So I'm going to keep doing that now until I have filled that whole circle. And you will find that you'll get to a point with this particular stitch and then you'll think, oh, where do I go now because I haven't got enough holes left. Well, that's absolutely fine. We just carry on working in our stitch pattern. So I've got my short stitch coming through on the back, I've got my long stitch on the front. I haven't pulled this one completely tight yet because it gives me a bit of a marker so I know where I've got to insert my needle to go down to create that next stitch. So I'm just going to keep working into that, turning over, and then I'll show you the next bit. So I've now got back to where I started and I'm just going to keep going until I get back round to the point just before my threads start to sort of have double up in the same hole, and there we will have quite a nice sort of starting pattern to our flower. So each hole now has 2 threads coming out of it, and I'm just about to make that last final stitch where I pull that one through, keep the paper nice and flat while I turn it over, and I'm just going to secure the tail of my thread with some tape to stop it coming out of the paper. So again, I'll just try and tape it in a slightly different spot to that first one, cut my thread off, and I can keep that length in case there's another bit that I wish to do with the same colour. So we're now going to repeat the process, but this time I'm going to use my second colour and I am only going round 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 holes. So that will give us a slightly sort of bigger gap in our circle, and it'll give us this nice kind of little overlapped effect on that top layer. Again, always start and finish in the same way, especially if you happen to run out of thread. Just keep your end on the back, tape it down, start the new thread, and you might find that you'll be able to tape the end of one and start the new one off with the same piece of tape. So we carry on, and this round it's going round 6 stitches. So I count my first one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you will notice that this one isn't quite as deep as that other circle. So this will give us a nice kind of almost like a halo effect around our first layer. With our third layer, we're going to be stitching the triangle, the sort of very tiny petal shapes here. And this is one of the areas where we're going to be breaking our thread art rules, because we will have to travel a slightly longer thread across the back in order to get the straight stitches. Now you can sort of weave in and out and then come back over yourself to create the sort of outer shape of the petals, but there isn't a way of avoiding sort of travelling the thread on the back with doing the upright stitch there. So again, starting the thread in exactly the same way, and I quite like to sort of stitch the petals as a unit and then move on to the next one. So I'm going to go down to create that point. This I'm going to have to travel on the back, there's no way of avoiding it here, and then we shall carry on with our stitches. So basically, hopefully you can see that pink layer, and we will have a couple of longer stitches on the back, but I think we can't really avoid that. So we're going to just go around and we're going to complete now the next layer of these small individual petals. We're now moving on to our quite a steep parabola here that we've got with a curve, and we're going to be starting at the inner circle that we have here and going into the opposite point right at that sort of far corner, but not right at the very corner. I'll sort of explain that as we look at my one. So on here I've brought my thread out and I'm taking my thread across to the other arm, and I'm going down at, not at the tip, I'm going down at that sort of penultimate point there. I'm then going to bring my thread up here and come back down to that first arm, but the next point along. So I've always got my short stitch on the back, and I'll have the long stitch where I can on the front, unless we have to tweak the pattern a little bit. So I've got that nice and flat. So I'm making sure that I'm coming around the outside of the thread, and I'm going to keep stitching. Now sometimes if you've gone over the tape, that's absolutely fine, just pierce the hole again and come back out. Now where this particular parabola is very skinny, I don't want to split the thread as I bring my needle out, so I'm making sure that where it's nice and close, I'm just angling my needle away so that I come up away from the thread and I don't split it. Now it will feel a little bit counterintuitive, like you're not kind of getting anywhere with this one because the angles are so steep, but keep hanging there. You will almost sort of find that you'll be almost opposite yourself with one particular stitch. So as I come up, I don't want to split my thread. Actually, I'm not too bad there, so I just angle away to make sure that I'm not going to catch anything, and then I can keep sewing in that same pattern. So we're almost there now with this one, and we repeat the other stitches in this way, in this colour, and you will notice that you do get quite a nice steep curve. Now to those of you worried about the sort of the very tips, when we come to do the inner pink layer, that will start at that very tip, so in effect there won't be any obvious gap between the two parabolas, so they'll actually be sort of filled in. So we're going to keep coming down this arm. I've just got a few more to do, and then we will just carry on and repeat the pattern around the circle to finish off all of these parabolas in green. So my last stitch now is coming out, and I'm going to go, in effect I'm going into that opposite side just like I did when I started, right up here. Take my thread through, and this is where you'll probably find you want to finish your thread off and then start a new one, so you're not travelling too much across the back. And now we just repeat that for the remaining arms with that particular parabola. So now we are onto our lighter pink row, and these are going to be starting at the sort of the very tip of the parabola and coming down again into not the sort of the other end, but just off of that. So we're repeating that parabola structure now and making a slightly sort of gentler curve than we've just sort of created with our green section. So our lighter pink is going to be repeating the parabola stitch pattern and working our way around each of these lighter pink sections. I've already attached my thread and I'm good to go, and as you can see we're just coming across, just keeping the stitch pattern. I'm going to come up there, go down, and gradually we will use our straight lines to create that curve. Tension is one of those things with your thread that you've got to be sort of really careful of. It's kind of, by this point in your design, it's probably going to be really obvious to say this, but if your paper is in any way wrinkled or pulled up, you know that you have pulled your thread too tight as you've been sewing. Equally, if you don't want to have just loops of thread or sort of anything sort of looking saggy on the front of the work, because that means it's a little bit too loose. And you want your thread to really sort of sit flat against the flat paper with no wrinkling or bumps or no saggy loops. What you can find is that by the time you sort of get 2 or 3 stitches on from your original stitch, that's when your stitches will start to settle down. So don't kind of panic if sort of stitch 4 doesn't look right, but stitches 1 and 2 will start to settle down, and you'll sort of see that repeated throughout the rest of the stitching. So again, keep an eye out on your tension, and you certainly don't want your thread cutting through your paper like an old-fashioned cheese wire, and then you'll know things have really gone wrong and things are really very tight. As we start to sort of build in the parabolas around our layers, we can see that where the green parabola started here and finished just short of the point, the pink parabola now on the other side starts at the point and gives the sort of illusion of kind of both colours having sort of finishing at the tip, which is quite a nice effect without having to sort of draw any extra lines. So keep going, it's building up really nicely. So our parabola flower is really starting to take shape. We've now completed the pink sections and we're on to the sort of slightly smaller petal shapes around the outside of those pink sections, and this in my other example is where they were in yellow, and I have changed the colour a little bit here because I wanted to just try something a bit different. Now you will notice with this parabola that I haven't pierced the hole in my example here, but I have in this example here. So I'm going to show you just a little trick that you might sort of do with the thread, which is very similar to what we did with our very first small petals, to sort of create a nice effect in the dip there. So let's get underway. So we're starting in exactly the same way as we've done before. The difference is going to be when we get to this middle section, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So I've completed my final sort of stitch of my parabola, but now what I'm going to do is a couple of back stitches just to sort of tie and make a nice sort of little tip here. So I've just about got enough thread, so I'm going to make sure I come up and go down, and then I can go through that same hole again and go down onto the other side. And that's just something you can do to add a little bit of difference and interest there. So we've now completed rows 1 to 6, and we're on to 7 and 8, which are my darker pink and purple rows. So this one is the number 7 and this one is number 8, and then we are done. So again, I'm making sure that I'm following the technique to do my parabola. I'm not going to worry that this bit on my dark pink row isn't stitched, because when I start with the purple, that final layer will be starting at this point, and that will then give the illusion that my pink thread has actually gone all the way up to the top as well. So we're almost there. So we are now on to our outer set of parabolas, our final row, and again we are completing them in exactly the same way, exactly the same technique as we've done so far, and this final row really does help to bring the rest of the design to life. So we're almost there. Well done everyone. Here we have our finished parabolic flower in all its glory. Now I've left a lot of my pencil lines, a lot of my stitch lines on here, so that's always going to sort of take away slightly from the piece. But as you can see, it's really kind of quite striking when it's finished. So play about with it. Maybe you can photocopy your pricking, enlarge it, reduce it, change the colours, you know, change the background, all kinds of things that you can have a play with and enjoy. Thank you very much for joining me.